Good morning, Sunday school class. I'm not able to be with you live today because I'm teaching another class this morning at the church I attend here in Houston. But I'm recording this for you, and I look forward to being back with you again next week. So the Sunday school lesson that I want to present to you today is a little bit different from some of what we've been doing recently. But it is picking up something I mentioned a few months ago when we started Jeremiah. And I told you a few months ago when we started that one of the things that I wanted to do was to eventually take some theological themes in Jeremiah and trace how they're used elsewhere in the Bible. And sometimes that's just running parallels between Jeremiah and other parts of the Old Testament. And sometimes that's seeing how the New Testament picks up Jeremiah's language and imagery and prophecies and uses them. So we're going to do some of that today. We're going to look at a theme. Actually, it's I guess you would call it a motif, although you could call it a symbol, of the cup of God's wrath. And this is something that shows up in Jeremiah. It's prominent in the prophecy we're about to look at. And then it shows up again a few other places in the Old Testament. And then it shows up again in a couple of very crucial places in the New Testament. So the cup of God's wrath. The passage we're going to look at, if you look now at slide 2, is from Jeremiah 25. And I'm going to show you those passages in just a moment, but they're both from chapter 25. And chapter 25 can be broken into two different parts. The first part deals with the 70 years of captivity. It doesn't talk about the cup of wrath at all. It does talk about God's wrath, however, and it talks about the historical setting for this prophecy. And then the second half is when we're going to get into the theme, actually I said it's a motif, of what we're going to be studying today, which is the cup idea and that symbol of what a cup means in Jeremiah. Now, if we look at slide 3, we find the historical setting for the book of Jeremiah. So Jeremiah 25, in slide 3, says this: "The word came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judah in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, which was the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon." So this is an interesting way of opening up because it pinpoints, it dates exactly when this prophecy was given. It's in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, which is also the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Judah. Now we're going to talk about why that's important here in just a moment. Before I do that, I want to show you a timeline. So this is the next slide. A timeline of the genealogies of the kings of Israel and Judah. Now the kings of Israel, the northern kingdom, were on the right. And they're kind of more spread out. They're the ones that are teal. And they represent, if you look in the little map in the bottom, they represent the northern half of the Israelites. And we call them Israel. And they were taken out, you remember, about a century or so before Jeremiah. They were taken out on exile by the Assyrians. Well, the kings in the north, the teal-colored, kind of go sideways because a king would rule, then his son would take over, and then that son would get killed maybe by a general or someone, and then that general would make himself king. That military leader would make himself king, and he would rule for a generation or two. Then his lineage would be cut off, and then somebody else would take over. So that's why you've got all this movement in the north. In the south, in Judah, which is the purple that we have on the left, there's much more stability, more continuity. So the sons of David reign, and they continue reigning, and it's actually pretty remarkable when you look at this historically. Most kingdoms didn't have this kind of continuity. It's pretty amazing. But what we get is the kings of Judah, starting with David and Solomon, who ruled over a united kingdom, then Rehoboam, all the way down to the kings at the very bottom. So if you look at this very bottom, where it starts to look like kind of like a cross. Down at the bottom, it gets wider, and that's because some of these guys were brothers. They weren't sons of each other, so they were brothers, and people were getting killed, reigning for just a few months, and then being taken out, and their brother would be put in his place. So we have Josiah reigning, and Josiah reigned for the beginning of Jeremiah's rule, and then we get Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim. And then underneath him, Jehoiakim, almost the same, but it has an N at the end. And then Zedekiah. So these are the rulers over Israel during the time of Jeremiah. Now, if you look at the next slide, I've got a slide here showing you the the amount of time that each of these kings ruled and what happened to them. So Josiah rules for 31 years. That's a long time. And he's eventually killed by Pharaoh Necho, who's going up to fight and help the Assyrians to fight against the Babylonians. He kills him, and then a few months later he comes back through, and Jehoahaz, who's Josiah's son, has been put up as king. Pharaoh doesn't like that, so he takes him out of being king. He takes him to Egypt with him, where he eventually dies. And so Jehoahaz only rules 3 months. So we don't really get much from this guy in the Bible. But we get Jehoiakim, who is the person that Pharaoh put up after him. Jehoiakim comes up to reign, and he, in his 4th year, rebels against Nebuchadnezzar, and he ruled a total of 11 years. So he rules for 11 years. In his 4th year, he rebels against the Babylonians, people he had previously had to submit to. And he does it partly at the instigation of the Egyptians, who had put him on the throne. So those were his allies. He rebels, but it takes 7 years for Nebuchadnezzar to get there. Now, the reason it takes so long is because Nebuchadnezzar, he rebels in the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar. Well, that was a very good time to rebel against a king who was over a large kingdom like Nebuchadnezzar was. The Babylonians had only been in charge for just a few decades as the superpower. They had rebelled against the Assyrians and kind of taken over. And so when Nebuchadnezzar becomes king, it's the 1st year, and a lot of people revolt. So there's a lot of kingdoms around Nebuchadnezzar that are starting to rebel against him because they're thinking, so he's a new king, there's transition here, this might be a moment of weakness, and we can exploit that. So Nebuchadnezzar has to go around putting out fires in other parts of his kingdom before he can finally get to the extreme south of his kingdom, which is Judah, right on the Egyptian border. So it takes him a few years to knock everybody else out and then take his big army and march all the way down to Judah to take Judah out. On the way there, before he gets there, Jehoiakim, who had been reigning for 11 years, rebelling for 7 years, dies. He dies before Nebuchadnezzar gets there. Jehoiakim, his brother, takes over. He only rules for 3 months. He, kind of following Jeremiah, although he's not necessarily a good king, he submits to the king of Babylon. He's taken to Babylon and given relatively good treatment. And then after he's taken to Babylon, the king of Babylon puts Zedekiah in, another relative of Josiah, puts him in, and he rebels against the king eventually. Now, it takes a few years for him to rebel as well, and I don't remember exactly how long he ruled before he rebelled, but when he rebelled, the king of Babylon came against him. He only ruled for 11 years total. So in about his 9th year, the king of Babylon shows up, and he digs his heels in. He resists, and he holds out against a siege for a year and a half, and it's a terrible catastrophe. Jeremiah has to live through this. There's starvation, there's cannibalism, there's a plague that hits the city, and eventually the people just try to escape. The leaders with the king try to escape, and when they do, the Babylonians take the city. So this is sort of the unfolding of the kingdom, and at that point is when we get the big exile, what we think of as the exile, where a lot of the rest of the Judeans are taken out. The city is totally dismantled, burned, the temple's burned, the walls are pulled down, the houses are destroyed, everything. Nebuchadnezzar believes the best policy here is scorched earth. Destroy the place. I mean, they rebelled earlier. I have to come back here in a decade to take care of another rebellion. I'm not going to deal with this again, so he just wipes out the place. Now, if we look at the next slide, then we understand why Jeremiah is given the prophecy he's about to give. Because where he's at right now is in a crucial turning point in the time of the kingdom. Jehoiakim has decided in his 4th year to rebel against Babylon. It takes a full 7 years before the king will get there. So in the meantime, all these people are prophesying peace, prophesying victory. Jeremiah is prophesying defeat, which made him very unpopular. So Jeremiah says this is a crucial time. So he dates this for us. Let us know this is a crucial time where policy's turning against Jeremiah in another way, where they're now going to resist the Babylonians. And Jeremiah says in verse 3, for 23 years I've been preaching to you folks. For 23 years I've been your prophet. And he's only about halfway through. He's got another 20-some years or so to go. But he says here at the bottom of this, you've not listened. So that we know what's coming next, right? If Jeremiah says, I've been telling you and telling you and telling you, I've been preaching to you, you haven't listened, we know the next word that's coming is going to be judgment. And this judgment is very specific. This judgment, when they decide to rebel against Babylon, when they decide to resist Nebuchadnezzar, Jeremiah gets this prophecy the very year they decide to do that. He says, because you have not listened to my words, I will summon all the peoples of the north and my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And it's significant again that he calls the invading king God's servant, which means God's going to use him to accomplish his will. And Nebuchadnezzar is going to come in, and it says he will completely destroy Judah and the whole area, which is what he did. Now, Jeremiah then gives us this prophecy in verse 11. It's not just they're going to be destroyed, but they're going to be a wasteland, and these nations are all going to serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. So Jeremiah gives a term limit to the punishment. He gives a term limit to the exile. Exile's coming, but there's going to be a limitation of it. It's only going to go for 70 years. Now, remember, they're going to be in rebellion for 7 years at this time, and then again later on with Zedekiah. But when the final destruction comes, then 70 years, more or less. And there's some debate as far as whether it was exactly literally 70 years, or if this was just a general ballpark figure that the Israelites lived through. And it was close either way. All right, now we're going to transition now to the next slide, to Jeremiah 25, the cup of God's wrath, and verse 15. We're going to talk about that, but I'm going to stop here and upload this video, and then we'll start again.